affected deals were frozen or canceled outright. Export terminals from Sabine Pass to Freeport are sitting on unused capacity, while storage tanks are overflowing with stranded gas. Meanwhile, Bloomberg reports that Australia signed over $20 billion in new LNG deals in Q1 2025, including long-term contracts with China National Petroleum Corp. And Korea Gas Corporation. This firmly positions Australia as Asia's new LNG backbone, replacing the U.S. in its former stronghold. Worse still, the cost to reroute unsold LNG to Europe has skyrocketed, with CNBC noting a 33% increase in transatlantic freight rates and reduced demand due to mild winters. U.S. firms are now offloading gas at a loss just to clear inventory. Financial Times calls it a geopolitical correction, where energy exports are now dictated by alliances, not just affordability. While Australia gains ground through neutrality and consistency, America pays the price for policy volatility. Reuters, March 2025. China suspends new U.S. LNG contracts amid trade dispute. $12 billion in deals put on hold. Bloomberg, April 2025. Australia secures $20 billion in LNG contracts across Asia, replacing U.S. suppliers. CNBC, March 2025. Transatlantic LNG shipping rates surge 33% as excess U.S. capacity floods the market. Financial Times, 2025. Energy trade now driven by geopolitics, not just price. U.S. LNG faces structural rethink. The numbers don't lie. Trump's 2025 tariff blitz has detonated a trade bomb on U.S. exporters. According to Bloomberg, American agricultural exports to China plummeted by 45% within just 6 weeks of the new tariff. Wheat, soybeans, and pork were the hardest hit, causing panic in rural economies already burdened by high input costs. Meanwhile, Reuters reports that China doubled its purchases of Canadian crude oil and LNG, signing new multi-year contracts worth over $9.7 billion. Europe, too, saw a surge in exports of machinery and automotive components to China, displacing U.S. suppliers. Trump's promise to protect American jobs is now colliding with economic reality. CNBC notes that U.S. manufacturing orders from China fell by 28%, triggering layoffs in key swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, ironically, the heart of Trump's political base. Financial Times describes the situation as a self-inflicted trade recession. China didn't just retaliate. It rerouted its supply chains, built alternatives, and reduced reliance on the U.S. permanently. The strategic vacuum was filled not by the U.S., but by its allies. Bloomberg, March 2025. U.S. agricultural exports plunge 45% after February tariffs. Midwest in panic. Reuters, March 2025. China inks $9.7 billion oil and gas deal with Canada amid U.S. trade breakdown. CNBC, March 2025. U.S. factory orders from China drop 28%. Manufacturing jobs at risk. Financial Times, April 2025. America's trade retreat. How the world moves forward without the U.S. A 10% tariff meant to punish Canada ended up crippling U.S. influence in Asia's energy markets. According to Reuters, China signed a multi-year agreement with Canada just 10 days after the tariff took effect, securing over 450,000 barrels per day via the TMX expansion, completely bypassing American suppliers. Bloomberg reports that Canada's upgraded Trans Mountain pipeline has become a strategic corridor to Asia, cutting shipping time by over 9 days and costs by 20% compared to Gulf Coast exports. The consequences are seismic. CNBC warns that U.S. Gulf producers are facing massive inventory buildup as China disappears from their buyer list. And Financial Times highlights that Beijing is now finalizing a 25-year LNG supply deal with British Columbia-based producers, replacing billions in lost American export revenues. By targeting an ally, Trump has triggered a long-term realignment of Asia-Pacific energy flows, leaving the U.S. sidelined in its own geopolitical backyard. Reuters, March 2025. China secures half of Canada's oil output after U.S. tariff rollback. Bloomberg, March 2025. Expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline slashes Asia export costs by 20%. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. oil exporters face glut as China shifts supply deals to Canada. Financial Times, April 2025. China eyes 25-year LNG deal with British Columbia. Washington's trade war didn't just isolate American oil, it handed the global LNG crown to its allies. According to Bloomberg, the $40 billion LNG Canada project, backed by Shell, PetroChina, and Mitsubishi, is scheduled to go live in the third quarter of 2025. Once operational, it will become the largest LNG terminal on the Pacific coast of North America, directly targeting Asian buyers. Reuters reports that Beijing has already signed multi-decade offtake agreements with LNG Canada, locking in over 10 million tons per year at rates 15 to 20% lower than U.S. Gulf exports. Meanwhile, CNBC highlights that U.S. LNG terminals are underutilized, with Asia-bound shipments down nearly 30% year-on-year. In contrast, Canada is rapidly scaling up to become the Pacific LNG gateway to China, bypassing U.S. tariffs and Gulf Coast bottlenecks entirely. Financial Times warns this shift is not temporary. Beijing views Canadian LNG as a geopolitically safer bet compared to U.S. supplies entangled in election cycles and sanctions. Bloomberg, March 2025. LNG Canada poised to lead Pacific gas exports as U.S. momentum slows. Reuters, March 2025. China signs long-term supply deal with Canada's major LNG export terminal. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. LNG faces declining Asian demand amid Canadian surge. Financial Times, April 2025. China's pivot to Canadian LNG exposes U.S. vulnerabilities. This isn't just a trade shift, it's an agricultural exodus. According to Bloomberg, U.S. soybean exports to China fell by over 60% between 2018 and 2024. The loss is staggering. An industry worth $14 billion annually is now bleeding out to Brazil and Argentina, who've secured exclusive state contracts with Beijing. Reuters reports China's Ministry of Commerce now actively prioritizes South American imports, citing price stability and geopolitical reliability as core reasons. This isn't about price alone, it's about trust, and Washington has lost it. In 2024, CNBC highlighted that American corn exports to China hit a 7-year low, down over 40%, as Spain and France stepped in to supply high-demand grains. Meanwhile, the Netherlands and Spain, once fringe players, now dominate China's pork imports. The Wall Street Journal warns that U.S. farmers are entering a permanent decline in Chinese market access. The combination of tariffs, political hostility, and aggressive Brazilian trade diplomacy has locked America out of the world's largest food importer. Bloomberg, March 2025. China's soybean pivot cuts deep into U.S. Midwest. Reuters, April 2025. China taps South America over U.S. for strategic food imports. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. corn exports to China down the low 7-year as Europe gained. Wall Street Journal, March 2025. U.S. farmers faces permanent loss of China market shares. The American pork industry is hemorrhaging, and Europe is cashing in. According to Reuters, China's meat imports from Spain and the Netherlands now surpass U.S. shipments for the first time in history, thanks to superior food safety regulations and uninterrupted logistics. In contrast, Bloomberg reports that American pork is now seen as risky, not because of quality, but because of Washington's unstable trade policy. As China tightens import inspections and slaps on retaliatory tariffs, U.S. pork shipments have collapsed. The Wall Street Journal highlights that U.S. pork producers lost over $1.2 billion in export revenue in 2023 alone. The ripple effect is devastating. Excess supply floods domestic markets, pushing prices down by 22%, and small farms are being forced out of business. Meanwhile, Spain's largest pork processors, like Grupo Jorge, are now entering multi-year supply deals with Chinese distributors. This isn't temporary. It's a strategic realignment. Reuters, March 2025. Spain, Netherlands overtake U.S. as top pork suppliers to China. Bloomberg, April 2025. Trade turmoil cuts U.S. pork shipments by half. Wall Street Journal, March 2025. U.S. pig farmers face export collapse amid China shift. CNBC, April 2025. EU firms lock in Chinese pork market as U.S. stumbles. The decline isn't temporary, it's systemic. According to CNBC, U.S. agriculture exports to China have fallen by over 38% since 2023, with soybeans, pork, and cotton taking the biggest hit. Small farms are drowning in debt, while Wall Street firms quietly exit the agricultural commodities space. But the crisis goes beyond farms. China has started systematically defunding its exposure to U.S. tech. A Bloomberg intelligence report reveals that Chinese institutional capital has cut direct investments in U.S. tech firms by 72% since late 2023, citing political risks and trade volatility. Tesla's EV sales in China dropped 24% in Q1 2025, while BYD surged 46%. Intel's AI chip orders were slashed by major Chinese buyers, who are now shifting to European and South Korean alternatives. Even Google Cloud is being shut out of key Chinese enterprise deals, according to Reuters. This isn't just about dollars. It's about the disintegration of U.S. economic leverage. As China realigns with Canada, Germany, Brazil, and South Africa, Washington's grip on global markets is unraveling in real time. CNBC, March 2025. U.S. farm exports to China sink. Small farmers at risk. Bloomberg Intelligence, April 2025. Chinese capital flees U.S. tech in record pullback. Reuters, March 2025. Tesla sales plunge in China as BYD gains dominance. Wall Street Journal, April 2025. China expands tech partnerships with BRICS, cuts U.S. exposure. The U.S. isn't just losing a trade war, it's bleeding economic influence. According to Bloomberg, Canada's agri-exports to China surged 38% in 2024, while the EU's exports of pork, dairy, and tech equipment saw a record 42% increase, replacing U.S. suppliers in key sectors. Reuters reports that Washington's tariff escalation has pushed even U.S. allies to reconsider supply chain partnerships. Germany, once heavily reliant on U.S. semiconductors, has signed a $14 billion bilateral deal with Beijing for next-gen chip and AI tech, bypassing Silicon Valley altogether. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal warns that by doubling tariffs, the U.S. risks creating a self-inflicted trade vacuum, with global buyers increasingly seeing America as an unreliable partner. The losers? American exporters shut out of Asia, while Brussels and Ottawa quietly fill the gap. And Beijing is playing chess, not checkers. China's multi-billion-dollar Belt and Road upgrades, now targeting Latin America and Africa, are forming new trade corridors that don't include the U.S. Bloomberg. March 2025. EU. Canada capitalize on U.S.-China trade breakdown. Reuters, April 2025. Germany strikes $14 billion tech pact with China amid U.S. tensions. Wall Street Journal, March 2025. U.S. risks isolation as global supply chains rewire around tariffs. CNBC, April 2025. Beijing's new Belt and Road Corridors cut U.S. out.